Sada bih želio da iskoristim ovu priliku da nam predstavim našega gosta, doktora Timotija Standisha. Kao što smo čuli jučer, on je naš gost, ima seriju predavanja da bolje razumijemo odnos među Biblije, nauke i čitavog procesa stvaranja. On je inače senior researcher na našem geološkom istraživačkom institutu, radi i predaje, koliko sam razumio, na Univerzitetu u Loma Lindy. I drago mi da ovoga jutra imam priliku da ga predstavim kao našeg govornika i vjerujem da ćemo biti svi blagoslovljeni s onime što ćemo imati reći. I'm just trying to explain this in English as well. I really welcome our guest this morning, Dr. Timothy Standish, who is going to try to introduce us to the great mysteries from biology, I believe, to better understand our origins, beginnings, and relation between science and the Bible. As I said, he's a researcher, senior researcher at the Geoscience Research Institute. He's a professor and teaching at the University of Loma Linda. I welcome him this morning, and I hope we're going to be blessed with what he's going to be able to share with us.
Well, thank you for your welcome. It's a delight to be with you here on this Sabbath day. I'm actually going to talk about history this morning. I love history, and when we're talking about creation and evolution and these sorts of things, we're really talking about history. What happened in the past? And what I hope to do is review, obviously in a very brief form, some of the ideas that have circulated in the world about these things. And I am going to start approximately 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, approximately, David wrote these words. He said, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good." Now, when you look at a text like this, it's easy to dismiss it. Some might say, well, what David meant was there's no God in Israel, or something along those lines. But when you look at who David meant when he used the word God, it's pretty obvious that what he means is creator, creator God. The God of the Israelites was not a local God. The God of the Israelite was the creator of the entire universe. So here, at least in my opinion, it's not unreasonable to read this as the fool has said in his heart, there is no creator. Growing up, listening to Bible stories and that sort of thing, I didn't have the impression that there were people at that time who believed there was no God. I always thought the problem was that they believed there were too many gods. There were gods all over the place, Dagon and Baal and Ashereth, just all sorts of stuff. And the Israelites, their big problem was that they kept worshipping other gods. But apparently, here, David is referring to people who believed there was no God at all. And in fact, he felt this was of such great importance that he plagiarized himself. He said it twice. If you look in Psalm 53:1, you see him saying the same words. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and have done abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. Now, I'll admit this is a little bit tenuous, probably, although I think the argument can certainly be made reasonably. But I wonder whether this is not the earliest reference we can find to the idea that there is in fact no creator, and therefore everything must have come about by some kind of natural means. We don't have to invoke a god or the gods to account for everything that we see. But of course, it wasn't just the Bible writers who were thinking about these things. And I have gone back and looked at what a lot of philosophers were talking about. The earliest extra-biblical source that at least I could find, and I'm hoping that some real historian someday actually goes back and looks at these things, but the earliest I can find is actually, of all places, in India, the home of Buddhist philosophy and Hindu philosophy. And we usually do not think of these, the home of these religions as being a place where there were people who thought there was no God. And yet, around 600 BC, there was an individual named Brihaspati. And Brihaspati is a fascinating character. We don't have much of what he actually wrote. What we have are arguments against what he wrote, where his works get quoted on occasion. But from that we can get a fairly clear idea of what he had in mind. He said, there is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world. There are no gods out there living a different kind of existence. Now, the interesting thing about Brihaspati's followers, his philosophy, by the way, was called Shavaka. The interesting thing about them is they actually developed a system of worship. Their festivals, if you will. Their festivals involved three primary components. They may sound somewhat familiar to those of you who are attending the University of Toronto. Kind of an interesting thing. The three components were consumption of huge quantities of alcohol, sexual intercourse with as many people as you could possibly pull it off with, and eating meat. Kind of an interesting thing in a society where vegetarianism is valued because of Hinduism. So these guys were pretty much going after everything that was verboten. And this was kind of a sort of an interesting thing. It is very interesting to me that you do see the same patterns repeated over and over and over again. When people embrace this kind of philosophy, it's not that they all 100% of the time become hedonists. However, 100% of the time, at least as far as I can tell, there is this does develop among the followers of this kind of belief system. Hey, you know what? If there is no God, if this is the only existence that you have, why not go out there and enjoy everything that you possibly can? You'll notice, by the way, that this kind of thinking is reflected in more modern thought. This is Jacques Monod writing, the Nobel Prize winner, and he said, "The ancient covenant is in pieces. Man knows at last that he is alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity, out of which he emerged only by chance. His destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor his duty. The kingdom above or the darkness below, it's for him to choose." This philosophy puts human beings at the pinnacle of everything. We are God. We choose what's right and what's wrong. And you know what? You can't judge me because we're all independent moral agents. And, so if I want to marry my sister or my dog or the tree next door or whatever I want to do, that you can't judge me. That's my reality. We're all basically gods, and we can do whatever we want. Let's go back in time again. Let's go back to the time of Parmenides. Now, he lived in the 6th century BC, so he's slightly after Brihaspati. Now, Parmenides, he is a Greek philosopher, and he's a kind of interesting character. He made an observation. Nothing comes from nothing. For those of you familiar with The Sound of Music, the movie The Sound of Music, you may remember a song. I believe Maria sings it in there. Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever will. Yeah. But she didn't come up with that, and neither did the people who wrote The Sound of Music. Parmenides made this observation. Things don't just happen. Everything has a cause. And this actually created quite a crisis in the philosophical thinking of the time. If nothing comes from nothing, then how is it that something exists? And why is it that we observe what appears to be change in our world? It's kind of an interesting problem. And there were two schools of philosophy that really came up out of this. The one school of philosophy was basically founded and led by Zeno of Citium. He said, you know what? What you perceive is all in your mind. Actually, there is no material reality. For those of you who've studied Buddhist philosophy, this may sound vaguely familiar. It's a similar line of reasoning. He was trying to account for how we, where does stuff come from when we know that stuff doesn't come from nothing? Well, stuff comes from stuff that's in our mind, and mind does not, mind is capable of things that are way beyond matter. So therefore, that's what's going on there. All the change that we see is just an illusion. But there was another, he believed in pantheism, that God was sort of in everything, denied the material world, and kind of embraced an ascetic life. Hey, if the material world isn't real, you shouldn't have to worry about your material needs and things. That's not real. It's all just in your head. You only imagine that you need lunch today. There's another line of thought. Okay, we'll call it the Epicurean line. Epicurus, he said, it's all just atoms. The atoms have an intrinsic property, and that intrinsic property is motion. So atoms move, but the fundamental particles, the atoms themselves, don't change. Some people think that the concept of an atom is a modern concept. It is not. It's an ancient philosophical concept, the atomos, the unsplittable thing, the unchanging thing. So the claim by the Epicureans was, yes, atoms get rearranged in different ways, but at a fundamental level, because the atoms themselves don't change, nothing comes from nothing, as Parmenides said. Now, Epicurus, he was a believer in materialism. And so the material world is all that exists, and he believed that the only reality, at least as far as you're concerned, is what you take in through your senses. What you see, what you hear, what you can touch and taste, and so on. And empiricism is an interesting philosophy. If the only reality is what you take in through your senses, then that's going to lead to hedonism. I mean, what is your purpose for living? It may as well be for taking in good sensations, good food, good music, those sorts of things. So he kind of went in that direction. It's all just the atoms. Let's explore this Epicurean philosophy just a little bit. And by the way, let me remind you, Epicureanism and Stoic philosophy are both discussed actually in the Bible directly. Look at what Paul was doing on Mars Hill. Who was he talking to there in Athens? The Epicurean philosophers and the Stoic philosophers there. Also, bear in mind that these two philosophies were the prevailing philosophies in the Roman Empire. So this is a big deal. We're going to concentrate on the Epicurean one because it does have a little bit more to do with science. It's interesting to note, by the way, that while Epicurean philosophy looks like it should be something that leads to science, because science is about empirical evidence, in fact, it turned out to be quite sterile when it came to science. He didn't achieve very much. So Leucippus, he was the founder of this atomistic philosophy. And he influenced an individual named Democritus. Now, Democritus is a fascinating character. Democritus was kind of a little bit like the prodigal son. What happened was he actually did wait for his father to die. But he made a deal with his brother. And he said to his brother, "You give me all of the money. Give me all of the cash that Dad had." And his father was an incredibly rich man. He made his money as a military contractor, supplying the armies of Xerxes. So there's an interesting kind of biblical tie in there as well. There's also an interesting economic lesson to learn. Yeah, sell stuff to the military and the government and you'll make money. But anyway, his dad had made all this money. He obviously had a lot of assets. The brother got the land and the houses and farms and all of these sorts of things. But Democritus took the money. And he spent that money on a world tour. He went all around the known world at the time. He may even have gone to India. And he collected together all of the wisdom of all the different places around the world. He was known as the laughing philosopher. So we have other sources plus Leucippus, this atomistic philosophy. He was known as the laughing philosopher because he apparently used to get there in the public forum and people would run their ideas by him and he would just laugh at their simplicity and ignorance because he was the wisest man alive at the time. He knew the wisdom of the world. Now, I should tell you that he also blew 100% of his money and wound up living down at the end of the garden of his brother's house. But in any case, it's sort of an interesting character. So he was a disciple of Leucippus. He expanded atomic theory. He believed in the eternity of nature, space, and motion. You see, this is the way that he got around things having a cause. If something's eternal, then it doesn't require a cause. And, by the way, until the 20th century, this was the prevailing idea. When Big Bang cosmology came along, it was a huge crisis for those who do not believe in a creator God, because all of a sudden you have a beginning and a cause is required, and really, this is something that people are still struggling with today. How do you get a cause for what we see around us? If you make things eternal, then you don't have to do it. In fact, one of the interesting things about all philosophies, all ideas about where everything came from, is that they all have a tendency to appeal to something infinite. Something infinite out there. We, as Bible-believing Christians, appeal to the infinite God. The Epicureans, they appealed to infinite space, infinite time, infinite motion. And that's how they accounted for things. Then we have Epicurus. And we've already mentioned he believed in materialism and empiricism, and his ideas led to hedonism. Now there's something interesting about him. He himself did not believe in hedonism. He believed in living a measured kind of existence. But there is an important lesson about this that we can get today. And that is this. It's something that I observed in my own colleagues who I went to university with, particularly when I was going to Andrews University. For better or for worse, all universities will have people in there with some really odd ideas. Apparently that's what's necessary to become a professor sometimes. And in this particular case, yes, there were some professors. By the way, I hope that this does not discourage you from seriously considering Andrews University for your education. Doesn't matter where you go, you will encounter somebody who thinks they've got a better idea. And there were one or two at Andrews University where I got a fabulous Christian education that I wouldn't trade for anything. But these people who had strange, unbiblical ideas, frequently they would live what we would consider to be very conservative lifestyles. You know, they'd be vegans and this, that, and the other thing. However, when their students embraced those strange ideas, they did not lead that kind of lifestyle. Once you embrace a Darwinian kind of view of reality, a materialistic idea of reality, there is no point in being, strangely conservative in your lifestyle. Why should you not drink? Why should you not take drugs? Why should you not have sex outside of marriage? There's no point in that. You're here, you may as well just enjoy whatever life has to give you and get as much of it as you possibly can. And so what you saw were the students who embraced these ideas, also embracing that sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle, which was interesting, even if the individuals don't. Apparently Epicurus himself was somewhat surprised to see his followers going off in that direction, and yet that's what happened. So a follower of Epicurus was an individual named Lucretius. Now Lucretius was a fascinating character. He wrote a book called De Rerum Natura. That's Latin for On the Nature of Things. It's actually a 5-volume book, and we can read it today. It's readily available, and it is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. He's summarizing all the knowledge of the time, and he is doing it all within the context of Epicurean philosophy. So he was a Roman poet, he was a popularizer of Epicureanism, and he believed in the naturalistic origin of matter and life. By the way, this book, De Rerum Natura, that he wrote, was a bestseller at the time. Every library that was worth anything back in the day would have had a copy of this book. And it's fascinating to me that this was going on before the time that Jesus was born. Here is an interesting quote from Cicero. Cicero wrote a book called De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods. And it is a dialogue between those who believed in various ideas about God or the gods. This is how Cicero has the Epicurean advocate in this conversation defining their beliefs. Now, I should tell you that Cicero was without a doubt very familiar with these ideas. Some people actually think that he edited Lucretius's work, but that's not a certainty. This is what he has the Epicurean saying. He says, we're bound to believe that in the sky, revolutions, solstices, eclipses. By the way, did any of you see the solar eclipse on Thursday evening. It should have been quite visible here. Unfortunately, I was in Chicago and it was overcast. But Thursday evening it was, yeah. So I was kind of disappointed by that. But anyway, solstices, eclipses, risings and settings and the like take place without the ministration or command, either now or in the future, of any being who at the same time enjoys perfect bliss along with immortality. So here you see one of the standard tactics that these guys had at work. You define the gods in a way that works for your philosophy. It's called basically winning by definition. He defines the gods as beings that are immortal and live in perfect bliss. Okay? That's certainly not the God of the Bible. But by the way, this should give you an idea of why it was that Paul lost his audience in Athens. They were with him right up to the point where he said, and God came down to earth and died and was raised again. That was beyond the Epicureans' ability to accommodate. That was not something Epicurean gods did. This is why Paul, as he traveled from Athens to Corinth, was thinking about what the issues were and everything, and he told the Corinthians, he actually wrote this out. He said, so when I came to you, I resolved to preach Christ and him crucified and nothing else, because he realized that was the sticking point. So he was going to talk about the hard thing for these Epicureans. And kind of an interesting thing. So anyway, for troubles and anxieties and feelings of anger and partiality do not accord with bliss, but always imply weakness and fear and dependence upon one's neighbors. Hence, where we find phenomena invariably recurring, the invariability of the recurrence must be ascribed to the original inception and conglomeration of atoms whereby the world was formed. God or gods had nothing to do with it. It's all by itself. Yeah. By making the gods so perfect that they ceased to interact with the material world, Epicurus rendered them irrelevant to material beings. By the way, there's at least one flavor of theistic evolution that does the same thing. It makes God so holy that he has nothing to do with the material world. But that's not the God of the Bible. There is no divine judgment, according to Epicurean thinking, to face after death. There is no immortal soul, and for all practical purposes, what is taken in through the senses is the only reality we know. You can imagine how attractive this was to people, and in fact it still is today. You don't have that fear of eternal burning hell, which you'll remember is a Greek philosophical idea, not a biblical idea. So if you're some poor person, living in terror of burning in hell forever because you haven't done enough good works, Epicurean philosophy liberated you from that terror. Furthermore, if you're somebody who just likes nice things and wants to live according to the flesh, this gives you a free rein to do it. So this makes it a very attractive philosophy for people. Yeah. Look at what Charles Darwin said, okay, and consider how it aligns with this philosophy. This is in his autobiography. He says, I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For, if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all of my friends, will be everlasting punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. Remember, Charles Darwin, what did he study at Cambridge University? Was it biology? No. It was theology. It shouldn't be surprising to find him making theological arguments. Okay? Now, he obviously didn't understand his Bible very well. Unfortunately, many theologians clearly don't. But this is interesting. What is it that he presents as a reason to not want to believe the Christian faith or the Bible? Eternal burning hell. This is why these doctrines are of such profound importance here. Materialism is what essentially Charles Darwin embraced. Now, you will hear people object to that assertion. Okay? Darwin had a very interesting and ambiguous view of things. And he was not above sometimes, invoking a creator even on occasion in his writings. He was quite good politically with what he did. He knew that if he went out there and said, made argument, sort of became the village atheist, that his ideas would not get very far. So he chose not to do that, probably quite wisely. But others obviously picked up the banner. But Darwinism, the belief system that we call Darwinism, it's basically a religious belief system, is a materialistic religion. And this is one reason why you see many of the things that go on about it. Here we have Carl Sagan basically making this assertion in Cosmos. By the way, all caps are the way he did it. This is an actual quote. He said, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." This is a beautiful summarization of materialistic philosophy. There's nothing but atoms. That's all there ever will be, and so on. Yeah. Here we have, again, a summary of the ideas of Democritus by an ancient author. And he says, Democritus held that atoms and the vacuum were the beginning of the universe and that everything else existed only in opinion. This is a materialistic view of things. Yeah. Here we have Lucretius writing. Remember, Lucretius is this Roman poet, popularizer of Epicurean philosophy. He says, "Therefore, beside emptiness and bodies," or he means atoms there, "no third thing exists by itself in all of nature. Everything else is combinations of these things. Nothing else exists." That's a materialistic philosophy that he's promoting. And he says, "Nature can be seen to be free of overlords. Everything she does is completely by herself, without help from gods. There's no supernatural, nothing that transcends nature." Yeah. "The world," said Lucretius, "was certainly not made for us by divine power. So great are the faults with which it stands endowed." And by the way, this is something I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. The problem of evil. This is probably the most common argument that is used against the idea of a creator God. The world isn't perfect, so how could God have made it? Here in more modern times, we have Stephen Jay Gould, eminent Darwinist, saying imperfection carries the day for evolution. What they do is remember, they're defining God in a certain way, and then saying, well, look, you look at the data, it doesn't fit that definition of God, so there you have it, there is no God. Okay? That's a very easy way to win arguments. However, it also runs the danger of separating you from reality if there really is a God. By the way, let's not go down that. We'd better manage our time. Oh, here we have more Epicurean claims. This is Cicero here. I'm sorry, actually, that earlier quote that I gave you was actually from Epicurus himself in a letter. This is actually the De Natura Deorum quote. "For he, Epicurus, who taught us all the rest, has also taught us that the world was made by nature, without needing an artificer to construct it, and that the act of creation, which according to you cannot be performed without divine skill, is so easy that nature will create, is creating, and has created worlds without number. You, on the contrary, cannot see how nature can achieve this without the aid of some intelligence. I read this and it astonishes me because it sounds like something that I could read today. It sounds like Richard Dawkins or somebody writing. How many times have you heard that there are a zillion worlds out there and we should all be looking up into space and trying to find and make contact with these people out there? That arises from a philosophical idea. This particular philosophical idea. It does not arise from observation or anything like that, from data. Yeah. Here we have Epicurus writing, Lucretius writing, and I love the way he does this because he really summarizes things very nicely. He says, certainly it was no design of the atoms to place themselves in a particular order, nor did they decide what motions each should have, but atoms were struck with blows in many ways and carried along by their own weight from infinite times up to the present. I mean, how clever this guy is. He understands concepts like momentum and atoms and all sorts of stuff. These guys were geniuses. They have been accustomed to move and to meet in all manner of ways. For this reason it came to pass that being spread abroad through vast space and trying every sort of combination and motion, at length those came together that produced great things like earth and sea and sky and the generation of living creatures. I mean, think about it. There is the formula there that you see over and over again for how we wind up with living things. This is sort of the Darwinian formula, if you want it. First of all, you deny the possibility of design. And then after that, you say, well, what we see is the, yes, admittedly improbable, but inevitable result of a large universe and vast periods of time, providing lots of chances, and eventually you get living things and the earth and all the rest of it. This was before the time of Christ. In the world that Jesus was born into, these ideas were what were rattling around. They are not particularly different from those that we see today. Francis Crick, the individual who discovered one of those who got a Nobel Prize for figuring out the double helical structure of DNA, tells us, and you're going to see this quote again because it's of vast importance, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but rather evolved. So you eliminate the possibility, you eliminate consideration of design in nature first, and then you go with something else. Here we have Richard Dawkins, and look at how he invokes vast time and a great big universe. He says, given infinite time or infinite opportunities, anything is possible. Those of you who are philosophers will realize that this is a nonsense statement. It shocks me that this makes it into print and is considered to be brilliance. But anyway, and then he immediately switches gears from from infinite to large numbers, which those of you who know mathematics understand are not the same thing at all. Anyway, the large numbers proverbially furnished by astronomy and the large time spans characteristic of geology combine to turn topsy-turvy our everyday estimates of what is expected and what is miraculous. This is the formula. Big universe, lots of time, you get the miracle, which is life. Something happened in the world. Something really big and empirical. Jesus Christ came. And he lived among men. He raised the dead. He died himself and rose again himself. Can you imagine the impact of that on a world that was steeped in these Epicurean ideas, as well as the Stoic ones, but we're not really pursuing those very much. John starts out his gospel making this fabulous assertion. He lays out his thesis right at the beginning. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." He's writing to Epicureans here. And read the Gospel of John, and you see how he constantly appeals to the person who doubts and then is presented with empirical evidence and then on the basis of the evidence believes. He actually starts out after this in chapter 1 with the calling of Nathanael, who doubted. He said, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" And then he comes to Christ. Christ does something. Nathanael says, "You're the Son of God. You're the Messiah." And Jesus says, "Hey, wait, you're going to see a lot more." It's really interesting. Thomas demanded the physical evidence that Jesus was risen again, and he got it. Constantly, John does this. Oh, Athenagoras of Athens. There are a lot of great stuff here, but I'm going to have to wrap this up. But this is absolutely beautiful. What we see in the early church after the disciples died is these early church fathers appealing to the creation, appealing to the evidence, explaining what they believe, in this particular case, in a letter to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Let's talk about William Paley and Charles Darwin. William Paley wrote a book called Natural Theology, in which he made the logical argument that, hey, if you find something that looks designed like a watch, then it's reasonable to infer a watchmaker. And so therefore, if we look at nature, we see things that look designed, so it's reasonable to infer God. Paley tested his analogy against various things. Darwin writes about reading Paley's book. He claimed that Paley's natural theology gave me as much delight as did Euclid. I did not at the time trouble myself about Paley's premises. Okay? So he was aware of this, and if you look at The Origin of Species, again, it's an argument against design in nature. It was a response to Paley. By filtering natural variation via natural selection, Darwin sought to show that purpose in organisms is only apparent. It's just an illusion. Ironically, Darwin's position relies on theological premises, not on the copious data he invokes, and appears to be an attempt to solve the problem of evil in nature, which we will talk about this afternoon. Cornelius Hunter put this in a very nice, succinct way. He said, "The whole point of Darwin's theory was to separate God from the world in order to explain its inefficiencies and quandaries. He couldn't then smuggle God back into the theory to explain complexity. Rather than saying that evolution is anti-religious, it would be more accurate to say that evolution is religious. It very much hinges on a particular type of God, one who would only create a world suited to our tastes." By the way, remember, the world could have been created by a God who created it to make us miserable. But it wasn't. That's why the gospel is so wonderful. God actually loves us. This is Michael Roos. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Florida, I believe it is now. A very interesting guy. He is a Darwinist and very proud of it. He says, evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. The bottom line is this. Nothing is new. What we see today is pretty much exactly what was seen by the disciples. The difference was they turned the world upside down because they knew Jesus. It seems to me that it would be very wise to go back and see what they actually did. because they lived in a world very similar to the world in which we live today in the West. A world in which different philosophies, but particularly a materialistic philosophy, was exceedingly popular. And yet they, through their witness, were able to turn that world upside down. It's a truly amazing thing. Solomon put things this way. He said, "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, See, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us." There is nothing new, particularly when it comes to this issue of creation and evolution. The arguments, amazingly, are the same today as they were 2,000 years ago, probably as they were 3,000 years ago. So I encourage you, look at the Bible, see how the Bible writers responded to these arguments, because they were definitely well aware of them. And it's an amazing thing to understand that that's the world, a world very much like our own, that they were talking about the Creator God in. By the way, one last factoid, and then I shall end. If you look at the Old Testament, at the number of books that talk about the creation, the percentage is about 50%. Okay, that unambiguously reference the creation in the Old Testament. If you look at the New Testament, it's about 2/3 of the books, even though they tend to be relatively short, that mention the creation. Look at the book of Acts. The creation is mentioned over and over and over and over again. The New Testament, percentage-wise at least, talks more about the creation than the Old Testament does. I believe that's a reflection of the world in which they were living. Thank you, and God bless you.